Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan is the kind of establishment where business gets conducted over porterhouse steaks and expensive wine, where the dining room fills with executives and lawyers and the occasional celebrity, where the holiday season brings a particular energy to an already bustling corner of Midtown. On the evening of December 16th, 1985, as Christmas shoppers crowded the sidewalks and office workers hurried toward Grand Central Terminal, two men stepped out of a black Lincoln in front of that restaurant and walked directly into the most brazen assassination in New York organized crime history. Paul Castellano, 70 years old, boss of the Gambino crime family, and Thomas Bilotti, 45 years old, his underboss and bodyguard, were shot to death on a crowded Manhattan street at the height of evening rush hour by gunmen who melted into the holiday crowds before anyone could respond. The hit was not sanctioned by the Commission. The men who planned it never sought approval. John Gotti, the capo who ordered the murders, violated the most fundamental rule in the American Mafia. You do not kill a boss without Commission permission, and he got away with it, for years. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. It is genuinely one of the best parts of doing this. If you are new here and want more history like this delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to Manhattan, and the rule that John Gotti decided no longer applied to him. To understand why what happened at Sparks Steakhouse mattered, you have to understand what the Commission was and what it was designed to prevent. The Commission was formed in 1931 by Charles Lucky Luciano in the aftermath of the Castellammarese War, a bloody conflict between New York crime families that had killed dozens of men and threatened to destroy organized crime's profitability through constant violence. Luciano abolished the autocratic boss of all bosses position that Salvatore Maranzano had claimed, replacing it with a ruling council composed of the bosses of the 5 families of New York, plus representatives from Chicago, Buffalo, and other major cities. The Commission's purpose was straightforward: mediate disputes between families, allocate territories and rackets, prevent the kind of warfare that brought law enforcement attention and destroyed everyone's income. The structure worked because it replaced personal ambition with institutional process. Decisions were reached through voting among the bosses, with each boss holding one vote. For major actions such as approving the killing of a boss, a made man, or initiating interfamily conflict, Commission sanction was required to legitimize the move and prevent retaliatory wars. The rule was absolute. You could not kill a boss without majority support from the Commission. The punishment for violating that rule was death. The Commission had approved boss killings before. In 1979, acting Bonanno boss Carmine Galante was shot to death in a Brooklyn restaurant after the Commission determined he had become too ambitious and was threatening the interests of other families. The hit was sanctioned, carried out, and the Bonanno family installed new leadership with Commission approval. In 1957, Gambino family underboss Albert Anastasia was murdered while sitting in a barber chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. That hit had the support of Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese, and the Commission accepted it afterward as necessary to remove a boss who had become too violent and unpredictable. The difference between those killings and what John Gotti was about to do was simple. Those hits had institutional support. Gotti's would not. The rule existed for a reason that every made man understood. If any capo could kill his boss whenever he felt like it, the resulting chaos would trigger blood wars that could last for years, destroy families, and bring federal law enforcement down on everyone. The Commission was organized crime's Supreme Court, its legislature, and its executive board all in one. By 1985, the Commission was weakened. The Mafia Commission trial had begun with indictments unsealed on February 25, 1985, charging 9 New York Mafia leaders, including Paul Castellano, with narcotics trafficking, loan sharking, gambling, labor racketeering, and extortion. Most of the sitting bosses were facing life sentences, but the Commission still existed, its authority was still recognized, and the rule against unsanctioned boss killings was still absolute. John Gotti knew that rule. He knew it would be too risky to solicit support from the other 4 bosses. since they had long-standing ties to Castellano, so he decided to do it anyway. On October 15th, 1976, Carlo Gambino died at his home of natural causes. Gambino had been boss of the family since 1957, when Albert Anastasia was murdered. He had built the organization into the most powerful crime family in New York through a combination of legitimate business operations, labor union control, and disciplined management. Against expectations, Gambino appointed his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, to succeed him rather than his longtime underboss, Aniello Dellacroce. Gambino believed the family would benefit from Castellano's focus on white-collar businesses, construction rackets, and labor union infiltration rather than street-level crime. Dellacroce was in prison for tax evasion at the time of Gambino's death and was unable to contest the succession. On November 24th, Castellano's appointment was confirmed at a meeting with Dellacroce present. The arrangement that followed effectively split the Gambino family into two rival factions. Castellano arranged for Dellacroce to remain as underboss, while Castellano directly ran the family's affairs, but the deal created a geographic and philosophical division. Castellano controlled the Brooklyn faction, focused on white-collar operations, construction industry rackets, and waterfront control. He lived in a mansion on Todd Hill in Staten Island, maintained a sophisticated public image, and operated from a distance. He preferred meetings with lawyers and businessmen to time spent on the street. He strictly forbade narcotics trafficking, making it clear that anyone caught dealing drugs would be killed. Dellacroce controlled the Manhattan faction, managed street-level crews operating out of the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, and represented traditional mob activities, loan sharking, gambling, hijacking, and the kind of hands-on criminal work that had built organized crime in the first place. The two men had different visions for what the family should be. Castellano saw the future in legitimate business fronts and labor union control. Dellacroce believed in the old ways, in loyalty to the men on the street who generated the cash that moved up the chain. Many in Dellacroce's faction resented Castellano's appointment. They felt Dellacroce should have been named boss. They viewed Castellano as a businessman rather than a true crime boss, someone who had married into the family through Carlo Gambino's sister and inherited power rather than earning it. They resented his distance from street operations, his focus on white-collar crime, his refusal to dirty his hands with the work they did every day. But as long as Dellacroce lived, no one under him would make a move against Castellano. Dellacroce commanded respect from both sides. He had been Carlo Gambino's most trusted confidant for decades. He understood both the old ways and the new realities. His presence as underboss was the only thing preventing open conflict between the two factions. He held the family together through force of personality and institutional authority, making clear that anyone who moved against Castellano would answer to him. That arrangement lasted 9 years. Among the men who reported to Dellacroce was a Queens-based capo, whose ambition and loyalty to the underboss would define the next chapter of the family's history. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born on October 27, 1940, in the Bronx. He grew up in poverty, one of 13 children in a family where his father worked irregular day labor jobs and income was never certain. Gotti turned to street gangs in his teens, finding in criminal life the structure and income his legitimate world never provided. He ran errands for Carmine Fatico, a soldier in the Gambino family, and graduated to hijacking trucks at Idlewild Airport, which would later be renamed Kennedy Airport. He worked with his brother Gene and his closest friend Angelo Ruggiero, stealing loads of merchandise and selling them through fences connected to the family. In February of 1968, Gotti was arrested for hijacking after United Airlines employees identified him as the man who had signed for stolen merchandise. 2 months later, while out on bail, he was arrested again for stealing a load of cigarettes worth $50,000 on the New Jersey Turnpike. He served time for the hijackings and during that period met the man who would become his mentor. Aniello Dellacroce was everything Gotti aspired to be, a man who commanded respect through violence and loyalty, who operated at the highest levels of the organization, who represented the street-level traditions Gotti believed in. The two men were similar in temperament. Both had violent streaks, both cursed frequently, both were heavy gamblers. Dellacroce took a strong liking to Gotti and began grooming him for higher position. In 1972, when Fatico was indicted on loan sharking charges and could not associate with known felons as a condition of his release, he named Gotti acting capo of the Bergen crew. Gotti frequently traveled to the Ravenite Social Club in Manhattan to brief Dellacroce on the crew's activities. The relationship deepened. In 1973, Gotti was assigned to a hit team tasked with finding James McBratney, who had kidnapped and murdered Emmanuel Gambino, Carlo Gambino's nephew. The hit was supposed to be executed quietly, with McBratney abducted by men posing as police officers. Instead, the confrontation turned public and McBratney was shot to death in full view of witnesses in a Staten Island bar. Gotti was arrested for manslaughter and served 2 years. In 1976, the Gambino family membership books were reopened after being closed since the Appalachian meeting in 1957. When Gotti was released from prison in July of 1977, he was immediately initiated into the family as a made man and promoted to replace Fatico as capo of the Bergen crew. The crew reported directly to Dellacroce as part of the concessions Castellano had given to keep Dellacroce as underboss. Gotti was regarded as Dellacroce's protege. Under Gotti's leadership, the Bergen crew became Dellacroce's biggest earners, running loan sharking operations, gambling rackets, and hijacking schemes out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens. Gotti took his cut of his subordinates' earnings and ran his own operations on the side, maintaining a no-show job as a plumbing supply salesman for appearance's sake. By the early 1980s, Gotti was running one of the most profitable crews in the family, reporting to Dellacroce, operating out of Queens, and watching Castellano from a distance. The distance between them was not just geographic, it was philosophical, and it was growing. The arrangement that held the family together began to fracture because of something that had nothing to do with succession or philosophy. It fractured because Angelo Ruggiero would not stop talking. Ruggiero had been Gotti's closest friend since childhood, a member of the Bergen crew who had participated in hijackings, murders, and every other criminal enterprise Gotti had built. Ruggiero's brother Salvatore had become a millionaire dealing heroin on his own and was a fugitive from justice. On November 9th, 1981, the FBI obtained a wiretap order on Angelo Ruggiero's home phone, which was listed in his daughter Princess Ruggiero's name. Ruggiero had told FBI informants the phone was safe. It was not. The FBI was investigating loan sharking and illegal gambling operations, but soon turned their attention to heroin trafficking. Ruggiero had earned the nickname Quack Quack for his constant talking. He provided a running commentary on everything going on around him, gossiping endlessly about family business, complaining about slights real and imagined, and discussing criminal operations in detail over a phone line he believed was secure. The FBI planted listening devices in his kitchen, dining room, and basement den. They tapped the phone in his daughter's bedroom. Mountains of incriminating evidence began accumulating on tape. On May 6, 1982, Salvatore Ruggiero died in a plane crash in Georgia. After his brother's death, Angelo was caught on tape discussing the heroin that Salvatore had left behind. The FBI recorded Angelo's attorney, Michael Coiro, telling him that Gene Gotti had found the heroin. The talk of heroin in connection with Gotti family members seized the attention of investigating agents. The tapes captured Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti discussing heroin sales and profits. Ruggiero was heard saying there was a lot of profit in heroin. The recordings also captured disparaging remarks about Paul Castellano, complaints about his leadership, and discussions about family business that should never have been discussed on any phone line. On August 8, 1983, the FBI arrested Angelo Ruggiero, Gene Gotti, John Carneglia, Michael Coiro, and Mark Ryder on heroin conspiracy charges. When Paul Castellano was arrested on racketeering charges as part of the Mafia Commission trial indictments, He learned for the first time that his home had been bugged by the FBI and that the Ruggiero tapes were the legal basis for obtaining that warrant. Castellano was furious. The evidence against him existed because Ruggiero had been recorded discussing family business. Castellano went to Dellacroce and demanded that he force Ruggiero to hand over the tapes. Dellacroce tried to placate Castellano, explaining that the tapes contained personally embarrassing moments that Ruggiero did not want anyone to hear. Castellano wanted the tapes for his lawyers, who were trying to suppress the introduction of his own recordings in the upcoming Mafia Commission trial, but Ruggiero remained adamant. He refused to give up the tapes. He accused his uncle Dellacroce of betrayal for even entertaining the thought. He told his lawyers he would kill them if they gave up the tapes. The standoff continued through 1984 and into 1985. The tapes had exposed that Gotti's crew was dealing narcotics in direct violation of Castellano's absolute rule. The punishment for dealing drugs was death. Only Dellacroce's protection as underboss and Ruggiero's uncle kept Ruggiero and Gotti alive. By the time the Mafia Commission trial indictments were unsealed in February of 1985, the situation was clear to everyone involved. Castellano was facing charges that could put him in prison for life. The evidence against him existed because Ruggiero had been recorded. Ruggiero refused to hand over the tapes, and Dellacroce was the only thing standing between Ruggiero and execution. On December 2nd, 1985, Aniello Dellacroce died of cancer at age 71. Within 2 weeks, the decisions Paul Castellano made in the wake of that death would cost him his life. Thomas Bilotti had been born on March 23, 1940, on Staten Island, the son of Italian immigrants. He became an associate in the crew of John D'Alessio and eventually rose to become bodyguard and chauffeur for Alexander DeBrizzi, an uncle of the D'Alessio brothers, who controlled the Staten Island waterfront for the Gambino family. Over the years, Bilotti became a close aide to Paul Castellano. Castellano saw potential in the ambitious Bilotti and took him on as a protege. Bilotti served as Castellano's primary chauffeur, bodyguard, and enforcer. FBI agents Joseph O'Brien and Andres Currens described him as basically a pit bull with shoes on. He was short, 5 feet 7 inches tall. He was stubby, a rock-solid 220 pounds. He wore a bad toupee. He had no tact, no charm, no sense of humor. His piggish eyes were too close together. As long as he was waiting on Paul Castellano, Bilotti was deferential, subdued, watchful yet calm. His self-esteem derived from adoration of the master. Problems occurred when Bilotti was sent on errands of his own. Out of sight of the boss, he got rambunctious. He tried to play the big shot. He overdid things. He got creative in a sadistic sort of way and embroidered gratuitous cruelty through what should have been straightforward business transactions. Bilotti was allegedly involved in at least 11 murders. He was heavily involved in labor racketeering, particularly with Teamsters Local 282, which controlled concrete and building materials deliveries to construction sites. After Dellacroce's death, Castellano made 2 critical decisions. First, he did not attend Dellacroce's wake. He cited his legal troubles and his desire to lay low, believing that being seen at a mobster's funeral would not help his case in the upcoming commission trial. The Manhattan faction viewed this as a grave insult to Dellacroce and to everyone who had served under him. A boss who would not honor his underboss at death was a boss who had no respect for the men who generated his income. Second, Castellano immediately named Thomas Bilotti as the new underboss. The appointment was made unilaterally, without input from other capos. Many family members felt they were more deserving of the position. Bilotti had little diplomatic skill. He was seen as Castellano's muscle, rather than as leadership material. The appointment of a bodyguard to the second highest position in the family was read as an insult by men who had spent decades earning their positions. Castellano also hinted that he planned to break up John Gotti's crew. With Castellano facing life in prison and Bilotti positioned as his successor, Gotti and the other Dellacroce loyalists understood exactly what was coming. Their faction would be shut out of leadership for another generation. Bilotti would consolidate power, dismantle the crews that had been loyal to Dellacroce, and likely have Gotti and others killed over the heroin tapes. Dellacroce had kept the peace for 9 years through force of personality and institutional authority. His death removed the restraint. Castellano's failure to attend the wake insulted everyone who had served under Dellacroce. The appointment of Bilotti as underboss told the Manhattan faction exactly where they stood, and Gotti understood that if Castellano lived, his crew would be dismantled and he himself would likely be killed over the heroin tapes. Gotti had a decision to make, and he had less than 2 weeks to make it. After Dellacroce's death and the appointment of Bilotti, Gotti began assembling the men who would help him violate the most fundamental rule in organized crime. The core group included Frank DeCicco, a longtime Castellano loyalist who had turned against him, Salvatore Gravano, a powerful capo who controlled construction rackets, Angelo Ruggiero, whose wiretap tapes had created the crisis, Robert DiBernardo, and Joseph Armoni. DeCicco's participation was crucial because he still had Castellano's trust and could provide inside information about the boss's movements. Gravano was initially reluctant to support the hit, but he concluded that backing it was the most realistic way to protect his own crew and future within the family. Gotti knew the traditional protocol. To kill a boss, you needed commission approval. The commission consisted of the bosses from the 5 families of New York, plus Chicago and other cities. 4 of the 5 New York bosses had long-standing ties to Castellano. Vincent Gigante, boss of the Genovese family, was Castellano's close ally in business. They had made piles of cash together in construction and waterfront rackets. Soliciting Gigante's support would be suicide. Gigante would warn Castellano immediately. The other bosses were facing their own legal troubles in the commission trial. Approaching them would be too risky. They would either warn Castellano or demand concessions that Gotti could not afford to give. Instead, Gotti got support from younger generation figures in the Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families, who were frustrated with their own leadership and saw opportunity in the chaos that Castellano's death would create. Gotti did not seek formal commission approval. He made the calculation that the commission was too weakened by federal prosecution to enforce its rules. Most sitting bosses were under indictment. They were consumed with their own legal troubles. By the time the commission could organize a response, Gotti would control the largest family in New York and present them with a fait accompli. The rationalization was simple. Castellano was going to prison for life anyway. The commission trial would likely result in convictions. Better to act now, install new leadership, and present the commission with a finished fact than to wait and let Bilotti consolidate power. Gambino family consigliere Joseph Gallo gave his complicity to the plan, signaling that at least one member of the family's leadership structure would accept the transition. The conspirators understood they were gambling with their lives. If the commission united against them, they would all be killed. But if they succeeded in taking over the family quickly and completely, the commission might accept the fait accompli, rather than trigger a war that would destroy everyone's income. The decision had been made. The commission would not be consulted. The rule that had governed organized crime for 50 years would be violated, and Frank DeCicco, who still had Castellano's trust, would provide the information they needed to choose the time and place. December 16th, 1985. Frank DeCicco had tipped Gotti that Castellano would be meeting at Sparks Steakhouse that evening. The meeting was scheduled for early evening. Castellano and Bilotti would be driving together from Staten Island. The hit team assembled with military precision. 11 Gambino members were involved. 4 primary shooters, Salvatore Scala, Vincent Artuso, Edward Lino, and John Carneglia. Several backup shooters, including Angelo Ruggiero, were positioned nearby but would never be called into action. Getaway drivers waited at predetermined locations. The shooters dressed in beige trench coats and Russian-style fur hats to stand out as little as possible in the December cold while remaining distinctive enough to identify each other. They positioned themselves near the restaurant entrance on East 46th Street near 3rd Avenue. John Gotti and Salvatore Gravano parked across the street in a car with tinted windows. Gotti had a walkie-talkie to communicate with the hit team. It was the Christmas shopping season. Hundreds of people crowded Manhattan streets. Office workers hurried toward trains. Shoppers carried bags. Holiday lights reflected off car windows. Evening rush hour in Midtown Manhattan, one of the busiest corners of one of the largest cities on earth. At approximately 5:16 in the evening, Paul Castellano's black Lincoln pulled up to the restaurant. Bilotti was driving. Gotti and Gravano visibly confirmed that both Castellano and Bilotti were inside the vehicle. Gotti radioed the hit team. The gunmen moved into position. Castellano exited the passenger side of the car. 4 men ran toward him on foot. They shot him multiple times with handguns and revolvers at close range. 6 shots hit Castellano, including multiple rounds to his head and torso. John Carneglia allegedly delivered the fatal shot to Castellano's head. Bilotti immediately exited the driver's side. He attempted to fire back at his assailants, but was either unarmed or unable to reach his weapon in time. The shooters turned on him. He was shot 6 times in the head and chest. He fell spread eagle in the middle of East 46th Street. Castellano collapsed on the sidewalk behind the open passenger door of the Lincoln. Blood streamed from multiple wounds. The entire hit was executed in seconds. The gunmen jogged away on 46th Street, moving quickly but not running, blending into the evening crowds. They climbed into a getaway car waiting at 2nd Avenue. Gotti drove slowly past the bodies. He looked to make sure both targets were dead. Then he made his exit onto 2nd Avenue, heading south back to Brooklyn. Witnesses on the street had seen the shooting, but it happened too quickly for anyone to intervene. On-duty and off-duty police officers were in the area, but the hit was so efficient that no one could respond before the shooters had disappeared. Paul Castellano and Thomas Bilotti lay dead on a Manhattan street in the heart of the Christmas shopping district, shot to death by members of their own crime family in a hit that had never been approved by the commission. The buffer was gone, the boss was dead, and the man who had ordered it was driving back to Brooklyn to claim what he believed was now his. Within hours of the shooting, theories began to surface about who had ordered it and why. News of the assassination spread immediately through organized crime circles and shocked both law enforcement and the media. This was the first boss assassination in New York since Albert Anastasia had been murdered in a barber chair in 1957. It occurred during the Christmas season in crowded Midtown Manhattan, in full view of hundreds of potential witnesses. Ronald Goldstock, executive director of the State Organized Crime Task Force, gave his perspective to reporters, suggesting that Castellano had been facing trials and a lifetime in prison, and that internal power struggles were likely involved. The bodies were taken to the morgue. Autopsies were performed. The Archdiocese of New York refused to grant Castellano a Catholic funeral, citing his notorious life and death. Castellano was buried in Moravian Cemetery in the New Dorp section of Staten Island. Bilotti was buried alongside him. Days after the murder, John Gotti was named to a 3-man committee to temporarily run the family pending the election of a new boss. The committee consisted of Gotti, Joseph Gallo, and Frank DeCicco. An internal investigation into Castellano's murder was also announced. This was pure formality. It was an open secret that Gotti was acting boss in all but name. Nearly all of the family's capos knew that Gotti had been the one behind the hit. 2 weeks after the murder, Gotti was formally elected as the new boss of the Gambino family. Frank DeCicco was designated as his underboss. Gotti replaced Castellano's right-hand man and took control of the organization. DeCicco took control of all the white-collar rackets that had belonged to the Castellano faction. Gotti began visiting family capos on their home ground, something Castellano had considered beneath him. Gotti cultivated street-level relationships that Castellano had avoided, sending a message to the organization that the new leadership would be different from the old. There was no immediate commission response. Most commission members were under indictment in the Mafia Commission trial. Their attention was consumed by trial preparation and their own legal troubles. By early January of 1986, John Gotti was the undisputed boss of the Gambino crime family. He had killed his predecessor without commission approval, violated the most fundamental rule in organized crime, and taken control of the largest and most powerful family in New York. The question was not whether the commission would respond. The question was when. Vincent Gigante, the boss of the Genovese crime family, was outraged that Gotti had killed Castellano without following Mafia protocol. By 1986, Gigante was the only member of the commission who was not dead or in prison. Castellano had been his close ally in business. They had made piles and piles of cash together in construction rackets, concrete industry bid rigging, and waterfront operations. Gigante was old school. He believed in commission rules. An unsanctioned hit on a sitting boss could not go unpunished. If the violation went unanswered, commission authority would be meaningless. Any capo could kill his boss whenever he wanted, and the resulting chaos would trigger the kind of blood wars that had nearly destroyed organized crime in the 1920s and 30s. Gigante recruited Anthony Gaspipe Casso, the underboss of the Lucchese crime family, to plan the hit on Gotti. He also enlisted the support of Lucchese boss Anthony Corallo, who was himself under indictment in the commission trial. Herbert Blue Eyes Pate was recruited as the actual bomber. Pate was a Genovese associate and former United States Army munitions expert. He had no connection to the Gambino family, so his presence would not raise suspicion. Pate constructed a bomb using C4 plastic explosive with a mechanism from a remote-controlled toy car as the detonator. The target was John Gotti. The plan was to plant the bomb under his car or under the car he would be riding in, then detonate it remotely when Gotti was inside or nearby. On April 13, 1986, Gotti was scheduled to meet Frank DeSico and Salvatore Gravano at the Veterans and Friends Social Club in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. The meeting was also being attended by James Jimmy Brown Failla and Daniel Marino, longtime Gambino capos who had been close to Castellano. Gigante intended to kill Gotti and then install Failla as the new Gambino boss. Failla had been a friend of Castellano and would be acceptable to Gigante. Herbert Pate positioned himself near the club with the bomb ready. What the bombers did not know was that Gotti had called ahead to cancel. He told DeSico to meet him later that day at the Ravenite instead. Frank DeSico and Frank Bellino, a member of the Lucchese family, left the club together. They walked to DeSico's Buick, which was parked on 86th Street near the Barron Buick dealership. DeSico got into the passenger seat to search through the mess in his glove compartment for business cards that Bellino needed. Bellino stood on the sidewalk beside the car. Herbert Pate detonated the bomb remotely. The explosion was massive. It turned the Buick into a fireball and shattered windows for blocks. Frank DeSico was killed instantly. Both legs were blown off. One arm was severed. His torso was destroyed. Salvatore Gravano, who was still inside the club when the bomb went off, ran outside and tried to pull DeSico from the burning car. Gravano grabbed a leg, and the leg came off in his hand. He put his hand under DeSico's body and it went straight through to his stomach. DeSico had no blood left in his body. The concussion from the blast had blown all the fluids out of him. Gravano looked at his white shirt afterward. There was not a drop of blood on it. Frank Bellino was seriously injured in the blast. He lost several toes but survived. It was believed that Pate had mistaken Bellino for Gotti and detonated the bomb when he thought both targets were in position. DeSico was pronounced dead at the scene. Gotti had escaped the assassination attempt. Gotti moved quickly to gather his troops. All family capos and their crew members were ordered to attend DeSico's wake as a showing of strength and unity. A Drug Enforcement Administration informant reported that Gotti was very angry relative to the murder of Frank DeSico and that when he was out on bail or when the trial was over, there was going to be a war. But Gigante was not finished. The Chin had attempted to kill Gotti once and failed. The question was whether he would try again. What followed Frank DeSico's murder was not a war. It was something the American Mafia had never seen before. A boss who wanted to be famous. Gotti appointed Joseph Armone as his new underboss after DeSico's death. But Gotti's approach to being boss was radically different from anything his predecessors had practiced. He wore expensive tailored suits. He frequented high-end restaurants publicly. He held weekly capo meetings at the Ravenite Social Club in full view of FBI photographers and surveillance teams. He waved to cameras and to the press. He cultivated relationships with celebrities and politicians. The media dubbed him the Dapper Don because of his expensive suits and charismatic public image. Gotti embraced the attention rather than avoiding it. This violated every principle of traditional mafia discretion. At exactly the time Gotti was building his public persona, Vincent Gigante was shuffling around Greenwich Village in a torn bathrobe, muttering to parking meters, pretending to be insane. Gigante had built a system of invisibility and deniability. He swept his social club for listening devices. He whispered in bathrooms with water running. He never left his home unoccupied. His men were forbidden to say his name, touching their chins instead when they needed to refer to him. Gotti built a system of maximum visibility. His flamboyant style drew public fascination. It also drew government fury in equal measure. The FBI intensified surveillance of Gotti and the Gambino family. They planted bugs in the Ravenite Social Club. They bugged the apartment of Nettie Sorelli above the club, where Gotti held his most sensitive meetings. The recordings captured Gotti discussing family business, making disparaging remarks about associates, and implicating himself in criminal activity. Gotti was tried 3 times in the late 1980s and acquitted each time. In his first trial in 1986, he was acquitted after juror George Pape, juror number 11, was later revealed to have been bribed $60,000 to vote for acquittal. Additional trials in the late 80s resulted in acquittals each time. The media dubbed him the Teflon Don because criminal charges did not stick to him. Each acquittal strengthened his celebrity status and his reputation as untouchable, but each acquittal also increased federal determination to convict him. Gotti's tenure as boss was marked by the family's increased involvement in narcotics trafficking, precisely what Castellano had forbidden. It was also marked by heightened law enforcement scrutiny. Every move Gotti made was photographed, recorded, and documented. His refusal to hide in the shadows made him the most watched mobster in America. Vincent Gigante watched the spectacle unfold with cold calculation. The Genovese family survived under Gigante's invisible leadership. The Gambino family became the most targeted organization in the country under Gotti's visible leadership. By 1990, John Gotti had become the most famous mob boss in American history. He had survived assassination attempts, beaten federal charges 3 times, and built a public persona that made him a household name. But the same visibility that made him famous was giving the FBI everything it needed to destroy him. The tapes were accumulating, the witnesses were watching, and someone close to him was about to decide that loyalty had its limits. In late 1990, the FBI arrested John Gotti on racketeering charges. 10 days later, his bail was denied, and in the months that followed, something happened that no one had predicted. Gotti was arrested in December of 1990, along with Salvatore Gravano and Frank Locascio. They were charged with racketeering and murder. As trial preparation began in 1991, Gravano was missing from the defense table. He had agreed to cooperate with the government. Gravano became the highest-ranking member of the 5 families to break his blood oath and turn state's evidence. His decision was triggered by hearing Gotti on FBI wiretaps making disparaging remarks about him. The tapes implicated both Gravano and Gotti in multiple murders. Gravano concluded that Gotti would let him take the fall. The initial approach to the FBI was made through Gravano's wife, Debbie, who contacted agents to say that Sammy would testify but only in exchange for a deal. Gravano asked for immunity. The government refused. He agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. Under the cooperation agreement, Gravano would plead guilty to a single racketeering count, testify against Gotti and others, and debrief the FBI about every crime he had ever committed. The trial began in early 1992 in Brooklyn Federal Court. Judge I. Leo Glasser presided. The prosecution was led by John Gleason, Assistant United States Attorney. The defense team included Albert Krieger, representing Gotti, and Anthony Cardinale, representing Locascio. The centerpiece of the government's indictment was the assassination of Paul Castellano and Thomas Bilotti on December 16, 1985. Gotti was charged with 13 counts, including conspiracy to murder Castellano. On March 2, 1992, Salvatore Gravano took the stand. He testified for 9 days. Gravano confirmed Gotti's place in the structure of the Gambino family and described in detail the conspiracy to assassinate Castellano. He gave a full description of the hit and its aftermath. He testified that he sat in a car with Gotti across the street from Sparks Steakhouse watching the murder unfold. They used walkie-talkies to notify the gunmen when Castellano's limousine was approaching. Gravano watched from behind tinted windows as the gunmen shot Castellano 6 times and Bilotti 4 times as they exited the car. After the shooting, Gotti drove slowly past the bodies to confirm that both targets were dead before making his exit onto 2nd Avenue and heading back to Brooklyn. Gravano confessed to 19 murders in total, implicating Gotti in 4 of them. The defense was unable to shake Gravano during cross-examination. His testimony was corroborated by the FBI wiretap recordings and by other witnesses. The prosecution also called an eyewitness who identified John Caneglia as one of the men who had shot Bilotti. Additional testimony and tapes were presented. The government rested its case on March 24th. During the trial, Gotti called Gravano a junkie. His attorneys sought to discuss Gravano's past steroid use and his history of violence. The defense argued that membership in the Mafia was not in itself evidence of criminal activity. The jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men. They deliberated for 16 hours over 3 days. On April 2, 1992, the jury returned a verdict. John Gotti and Frank Locascio were convicted on all counts. Gotti was found guilty of racketeering and conspiracy to murder Paul Castellano, among other charges. On June 23, 1992, Judge Glasser sentenced Gotti to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He was also fined $250,000. Locascio received a life sentence as well. Gotti surrendered to federal authorities on December 14, 1992. On September 26, 1994, Gravano was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He had already served 4 years. The sentence amounted to less than 1 year of additional time. The government credited Gravano's cooperation with producing 37 convictions, 9 people awaiting trial, and 8 union resignations. Prosecutor John Gleason called Gravano's cooperation unprecedented and historical. He said the cooperation had decimated the Gambino crime family and created a domino effect for the future. Gravano entered the Witness Protection Program and moved to Arizona with his family. The head of the FBI's New York office remarked that the Don is covered with Velcro and every charge stuck. Gotti had evaded the law for the last time. The man who had killed his boss without commission approval, who had built his reign on visibility and celebrity, who had survived 3 acquittals and multiple assassination attempts, was going to die in prison. And the unsanctioned hit on Paul Castellano had finally been answered. Not by the Commission, by the United States government. What followed Gotti's conviction was not a single outcome, but a series of consequences that unfolded over more than a decade. Gotti remained in federal prison from 1992 until his death. He attempted to maintain control of the Gambino family from behind bars, using his son John Gotti Jr. as a conduit for orders. The FBI continued investigating his prison communications. Gotti developed throat cancer during his imprisonment. He died on June 10, 2002, at the Federal Prison Hospital in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old. It was the same facility where Vincent Gigante would later be held. Frank Locascio continued attempting to get out of his sentence. He remained imprisoned. His efforts for compassionate release were repeatedly denied. Angelo Ruggiero had died in 1989 from lung cancer. He never reconciled with Gotti, who had stripped him of his rank. Gene Gotti and John Caneglia were convicted on heroin charges and sentenced to 50 years each. Herbert Pat, the man who planted the bomb that killed Frank DeCicco, was sentenced to 12 years on unrelated charges. No one else was ever charged in the Castellano and Bilotti murders besides Gotti. The Gambino family was weakened significantly after Gotti's conviction. Leadership was disrupted, earning power diminished. Law enforcement attention remained intense. The contrast with the Genovese family under Vincent Gigante was stark. Gigante was convicted in 1997 and sentenced to 12 years for racketeering. He died in prison on December 19th, 2005 at age 77. But the Genovese family survived as the most powerful and sophisticated of the five families, according to FBI assessments. By approximately 2016, the FBI identified Liborio Barney Bellomo as the likely boss. The Genovese organization maintained operational security, remained secretive, and remained wealthy. Two men had run the two largest families in New York simultaneously, representing opposite organizational philosophies. John Gotti chose visibility. He became famous, his family weakened. Vincent Gigante chose invisibility. He built institutional discipline. His family survived. The commission never formally sanctioned Gotti for the Castellano murder. By the time of his conviction, the commission was too weakened to enforce the old rules. The Mafia Commission trial convictions had decimated the leadership. The era of commission authority had effectively ended. Individual families operated more independently, but were also more vulnerable to prosecution. The last major boss assassination in New York occurred in March of 2019, when Frank Cali was murdered. That was 34 years after Castellano. The code of silence, omerta, was no longer absolute after Gravano's cooperation. More high-ranking mobsters chose to cooperate with the government. The era of long-term bosses with sustained multi-decade authority was over. Prosecutor Andrew Weissman, who tried the 1997 case against Gigante, called Gigante the last of the long-term organized crime bosses in New York City. Anyone who took over after him, Weissman said, would not have the same history or power hold on the rest of the city. That assessment was made in 1997 and has proven accurate. The era of bosses who commanded sustained multi-decade authority over an entire criminal landscape was over by the time Gotti was convicted. The conditions that made it possible had produced one final example of what they could achieve. Then they were gone. The commission had one absolute rule: you do not kill a boss without approval. John Gotti violated that rule on December 16th, 1985. He killed Paul Castellano and Thomas Bilotti outside Sparks Steakhouse in full view of Manhattan. He never sought commission approval because he knew he would not get it. He gambled that the commission was too weakened by federal prosecutions to respond effectively. He was partially correct. No unified commission action was taken against him, but the violation still had consequences. Vincent Gigante organized retaliation that killed Frank DeCicco. He attempted to kill Gotti himself. The federal government intensified its investigation because of Gotti's visibility. The ultimate answer to the unsanctioned hit came not from the commission but from a courtroom. What the violation achieved was clear. Gotti became boss of the Gambino family. He ruled for 7 years. He became the most famous mobster in American history. What it cost was equally clear: Frank DeCicco's life, Gotti's freedom, the Gambino family's institutional strength, the commission's authority. The contrast between two approaches to organized crime leadership was embodied by Gotti and Gigante. Gotti was visible, flamboyant, and famous. That resulted in imprisonment and organizational decline. Gigante was invisible, disciplined, and systematic. That resulted in organizational survival. Both men died in the same federal facility 3 years apart. Their legacies demonstrated two paths and two outcomes. The commission never approved the hit on Paul Castellano. John Gotti did it anyway. He got away with it. Until he didn't. The institution he violated could not punish him, but the institution he underestimated could, and did.